Fantastic, everyone. Hell yeah. Okay. So, doing a bit of a presentation today. The purpose of this presentation is to prep the community for the vote that we're launching on the chain for dynamic TAO. Now, in order for that vote to pass, we have a variety of technical decisions that we've made that we need confirmation from the community that people should be making votes on with clear eyes. So without further ado, let's talk about that. Okay. So what we'll cover on today's talk is primarily vote dynamics. So how this vote will take place, how it can be updated, the timeline for dynamic TAO. Another thing we'll cover is subnet costs and the rate at which they will be added to the network. Those two things are highly related. We'll be presenting a slight change to the TAO emission design that was in the paper, although that's been updated and you can see that on the website now. And also our choice for TAO weight and what we see is the consequences of that choice. So vote dynamics. We will start the vote via triumvirate pseudo key call, where the upgrade, which you can see if you'd like to on this GitHub link, I'll share in the chat afterwards, includes all of the major updates. This is on testnet right now, so you can also interact with what is being voted for on testnet. The dynamics for the vote occur like this. We push an upgrade via the triumvirate, and we have 6 days to pass that vote. If 7 of the 12 votes are in favor of that upgrade going through, noting that abstains are rejects, the triumvirate has the option to trigger the upgrade. Now, we can choose not to trigger that upgrade, at which point we would, if, for instance, we have a change we'd like to make, we would have to trigger the voting process again, and another 6 days would have to pass. The goal of the 6 days is to receive feedback on the design and potentially take that feedback and turn it into additions to the upgrade that then get passed through the vote process again. So in the earliest, it'll be sometime next Thursday or Friday that dynamic TAO is launched on the chain. So if it is a Friday, prepare to be working over the weekend if you're a developer for one of the teams in the ecosystem as well as at OTF. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So today is Thursday. Sometime after this call and early Friday, we will push the upgrade vote, which will require 7 of 12 votes. In 6 days, that upgrade will go on to main, and we are then in a dynamic TAO environment. That's if the vote clears with 7 of 12. And again, abstains are no ops. If we are asked to make edits, we will take those edits into consideration based on the votes, and we will upgrade the code base and then go for a vote again. So this process can continue indefinitely until the relevant parties are happy. We hope they're happy with the design as it is today, but we don't want to upgrade the chain until we have all of the votes that we require. Let's talk about subnet rate and cost. This is one of the most important design decisions for the network because it tells us about how quickly Bittensor is likely to grow in the next year and the year after that, between halvings and into infinity. Now, some of these things can be changed later on, but we'd like to get these designs in place and working as best as we can with the launch. So a couple of points. Our choice of subnet halving time is the rate at which the cost drops back down to its original price after a registration. Our choice is 38,888 blocks and 38,880 blocks, or roughly 5.4 days. So this means that on average, a new subnet will enter the ecosystem every 5.5 days. The consequence of this design choice is that after the year, around the first halving next year, there'll be 128 subnets on Bittensor. So we'll be doubling from 64 to 128 early 2026. The rate will double from every 1 in 5 days, every 5 days, to 2 every 5 days, expected 128 per year until the next halving. So on the halving, the rate at which subnets are being created will double, and double again on the halving after that. So we'll roughly have 2,500 subnets in 10 years. Here we are with a chart of this showcasing this rate with the next 3 halvings over the next 10 years. So that's 2035 in the future. The rate doubles during each halving. We use the block emission to increase this value over time. Subnet cost is something that many people are asking me about specifically, but I don't have a good number to give because it really is determined by the rate and the demand. So no change will be made to the cost dynamics, which halves on successful registration. So the registration cost will be the same design as it is today. However, the min cost will be reduced to 10 tau. Note, this is a burn. So the pool is initialized at 10 tau, and 0 outstanding, regardless of lock size. It's an important dynamic. I'm just going to check back with the channel to see if people are hearing everything's good. Everything's good, guys. You can follow along with the presentation. All good. Great. Awesome. Okay. So this is what the cost would look like at the halving sometime in 2026. Because if we assume that there is a steady demand for the registration and the rate is increased by 2, the cost should roughly halve. Let's talk briefly about our choice of tau emission. Hopefully, if there's any questions, maybe we can actually go to the channel and I can ask some questions about this specific thing and also the vote. So the min burn is 10. That's one question I'm seeing in the chat. That's just a hyperparameter on the chain. And the reason we have a min is simply because we need an initial liquidity for the pools to not really destroy themselves with numerical instability. And there will be no deregistrations. The max reg rate is going to be similar to that rate MOG. So the max reg rate is going to be every 1 per day. So technically we could actually have more than what we're seeing, but the supply and demand should make the rate match what you saw in that graph. Tau emission. So instead of using the reserves of the pools, which was previously suggested, we're using an EMA of the price, an exponential moving average of the price to determine the tau emission for a subnet. I'll go through the specific design and code in the following slide. This parameter is super important because it affects how quickly your current price can affect your tau emission. So a lower or a slower EMA makes it more difficult to increase your tau emission with price. A faster one allows us to manipulate that price faster. So this design for tau emission, as I explained in a previous talk, is something that we know that we can change in a way that doesn't affect the majority of prices of the subnet tokens. And this is very interesting because it allows us to, in the future, become incredibly sophisticated about the way that we inject tau emission. It also means that if there are, in the future, some people that attempt to manipulate tau emission, we can intercede via an upgrade and fix that design. But we're pretty happy with this design as it is. So tau emission will not change, the 21 million cap, and it will not change. It will not be interrupted. So we're expecting the halvings to occur at exactly the moments that we would normally expect them with tau emission. This is the raw code design, and some people will notice the fact that tau in is no longer being cut or constrained on low prices. This is something that we've learned via the testnet that we think is positive. And the consequence is that if the sum of the prices of the subnets does drop below 1, there is actually a convergence, an asymptote back to a summation of 1, just as a consequence of this design that you're seeing on screen. This is important because we don't want to have a runaway of prices dropping to 0. So we also believe this is like the most fair emission schedule for the subnets themselves. Regarding the exponential moving average, what you're looking at here would be a simulated price for a subnet, quite ruggy, but definitely up and to the right, which is positive. And you can see 3 lines showcasing the different moving averages choices and also the suggested blue line that we have. This is over a year. The consequences of this EMA are the following. It's 3 to the negative E6. It takes about 30 days for, if you started at a price of 0 and we're at a price of 1, it would take 30 days to reach 0.5 and roughly 3.5 months to reach 90% of your price. You can see what that looks like in the blue line, which is the suggested on the chart. The reason we picked such a slow EMA is so that it was difficult for parties to quickly manipulate the prices of their pools to gain tau emission. It's sort of a slow movement. But the reason we do want to use price rather than tau reserve is that it allows for subnets that are born later, after a year or so, to still reach reasonable amounts of liquidity in dTAO. Another consequence of this is that subnets that disappear or have cascading drops in their price slowly lose tau emission, and we're not putting tau into the low price subnets, which sort of acts like an issuer that is using the market dynamics to select where tau should go. Now, I want to make it really clear that we intend to update this over time as we see fit, so that it should be clear for subnet owners that they shouldn't be attempting to manipulate or game this design. Instead, we will be designing it so that it's best for the outcome of tau. Okay, let's talk about alpha operations, which we're just calling subnet tokens alpha now. Many people have noticed. There's a few operations that people can perform. So actually, well, one high level note here is that we've reduced by 10x the testnet cost from 500,000 RAU to 50,000 RAU, or 5 cents per operation, which is sufficiently small to allow people to really interact with the chain after the launch. Alpha can obviously be swapped the tau via the liquidity pool. Alpha can also be moved from one hotkey to another within inside of subnet. So if you are a miner that has attained alpha during your mining operations, you can move that to a validator to accrue dividends. Alpha can also be transferred from one cold key to another cold key and a different hotkey through the pool. Now, whether or not this is obviously impossible to stop because people can unstake alpha and then transfer it to another cold key and then restake it. The question is whether or not that can be, if that's going to be an atomic operation. Our suggestion is that it can be toggled off by subnet creators, and there are some number of people that are suggesting that they would like more time to decentralize their subnets before they allowed atomic transfers. So this can be toggled off, and we've allowed this to be set by the subnet creators themselves. And we believe it's something that will help a few teams with legal quagmires that they're currently in with their jurisdictions, if that exists. These are the operations. As you can see them, unstake obviously through the pool and move between validators within inside of the subnet, and then finally a transfer to Bob unstakes and then transfers to Charlie, and then Charlie restakes. And whether or not that is atomic or not is a toggle. It's a call that a subnet creator can make in order to protect themselves legally if they see fit. Root dividends. So we investigated for a long while about whether or not it would be optimal for Bittensor and good for the long-term success of the ecosystem and the subnets themselves if we took root dividends and made them claimable. One of the consequences of claimable alpha dividends was that it's somewhat more complex technically and expensive for the chain, about 6 times as expensive for Bittensor's chain to make claimable alpha rewards. Possible, and we will continue to look to see if it is possible in the future to upgrade the chain and allow root dividends to be claimed in alpha tokens. But we've chosen to go with the design that is on testnet, where root dividend is actually allocated in tau on the tempo. So root stakers experience no significant user experience change. So unless you are opting in to expose yourself to alpha tokens on Bittensor, you will not ever see them in your wallet, and you never have to worry about them. Indeed, we expect that the dividend for tau holders on root to possibly even increase initially after dynamic tau, which I'll explain in a bit. A consequence also of root dividend is that the unstake pressure is high at first, but drops over time based on the tau weight. So what does this look like in practice? This is a nice UML diagram showcasing how dividends are calculated. Tau weight is the parameter which determines how much a single unit of tau counts for stake within inside of a subnet. The higher this value, the more dividend that is accrued to those participants that are staking tau on root. That's the blue here on the graph. Another change in the design of dynamic tau is that stake is now represented by shares in a total rather than absolute value. Some people might argue that this allows them to make different tax, suggest different tax outcomes for themselves because they don't actually accrue dividend at all until they unstake. This is a lazy accounting optimization which reduced the chain bloat of Bittensor and allows us to scale to many magnitudes more subnets. It reduced the chain bloat by about 40,000 times, which was quite significant. The shares that you own are thus attached to the hotkey that you're staking within a subnet. So some other points here. The combination of a hotkey's tau on root and a hotkey's alpha within inside the subnet is what is used for stake within inside of Yuma Consensus. And thus, the dividend is proportional to that amount and must be split amongst the participants on root and the participants within inside of the subnet. As you can see, Bob is in both root and in alpha, but Charlie and Lewis are specifically on just one or the other. Root dividend, you can see on the left-hand side, root dividends are pre-swapped to tau. And so this is important because this means that tau holders on root actually never touch alpha. They attain their dividends in tau as normal, and nothing truly changes for them from an accounting perspective. So the tax implications of staking does not change, potentially even gets better for people that are staking on root. Okay, moving forward. I'm actually going to go back to the screen here and see if there's questions regarding this. I'll read the chat if there are questions about this specific section of the slides. Lots of people typing. How will the Subnet's initial emission be calculated with EMA in mind? So prices will start at 0, and then they can slowly increase over time based on that EMA. Out of curiosity, does the subnet cost halving schedule align with the subnet alpha token halving schedule? No, it aligns with the halving schedule of tau itself. So there's 1 tau per block right now. After the halving, it's 0.5, and this is effectively just multiplied by the registration rate for subnets, which then increases the rate. So all emissions will drop to 0 initially, and it'll take hours, days to recover possibly. Let's get to that in a sec. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Tau weight. Now, this is a really important slide or set of slides for people. And right now we're doing a lot of mathematical inquiry into getting very specific about how dividends accrue compounding in alpha versus tau, but there are a few things that we can tell you straight up. So our suggestion for tau weight is 0.18, which was the original suggestion. Tau weight reflects the consensus power that a single unit of tau attains relative to a single unit of alpha in all subnets. Lower tau weight increases the yearly APR rate for alpha. Something to note, I'll show you in a slide following this. Larger tau weights slow the transition process from the current validators to the subnet alpha validators. So with a higher tau weight, we smooth over from the current design into the new design somewhat slower. A lower tau weight means we move faster, and the current set of validators will effectively be changed to those that are within inside of the subnet in a faster rate. Larger tau weight increases auto cell pressure on subnets and slows down their convergence to a price summation of 1, which I'll get to in a second. Let's go through these one by one. As a consequence of root auto unstaking, prices do drop initially low, as you can see on this chart. The lower the tau weight, the faster this reconverges back to a summation of 1 over 1. So why is that? There's 1 tau being injected per block, and so as a consequence, the prices of subnets should match a sum of 1 over time. So tau affects a steady state prices in the near term. This is over a number of years. Note the x-axis here. Lower tau weights hasten the rate that exchange rates reach 1-to-1 correspondence with tau. Note that this is assuming absolutely no buy and sell pressure on the tau weights themselves, so on the subnets themselves. So the actual market dynamic will exist above this foundation. It's important to note, though, that what we see on testnet with tau weight at 0.018, the prices are still below a summation of 1, but will reach that 1-to-1 correspondence after, similar to the blue line, over a period of time. Another important thing to note is root proportion. This is the speed at which root validators will lose their weight relative to validators in alpha. We want this process to be slow and stable. So as you can see, the suggested line is the purple one, which means that we drop to about 20% weight in subnets over the year. So at around the halving, tau weight would mean that root validators still have about 20% of the weight within inside of a subnet. The final thing is the APR, and this is perhaps the saving grace for the consequence of tau root selling. You can see the purple line here is the suggested 0.18. And this is the APR. This is the change in the amount of alpha you have if you were to own the first alpha within inside of a subnet. So a tau weight of 18% suggests that if you had 1 alpha initially, you'd have 2.5 by the end of the year. This is what will likely keep the subnet prices relatively high depending on this weight. Something that people should look at and carefully understand, because this determines the accrual of the ownership of the subnet over time for people that are early stakers. We didn't want this to be too high, of course, because it would mean the prices would go to infinity. So we've picked a fairly high value of 0.18. All of this can be explored more in the paper. And I've also released a number of code blocks that people can run to recreate these graphs if they're interested to understand the mathematics. Nick and Max, who were on the dTAO paper that was just released, also are publishing some more mathematical and financial modeling of how this will affect the subnets over time. Great. So those are our suggestions. The major ones being the transaction costs, the rates of the subnets being registered, how the vote will commence after this call, the tau weight that we're suggesting, as well as the operations that are available and how they can be constrained for alpha. These are the things that people had concerns about, but we're looking forward to hearing more concerns over the next couple of days. And if there is consensus, making changes to these designs before dynamic TAO goes live. Thanks, everyone. That's it. Let's go back here and see if we can get some questions from the audience. Perhaps people would like me to post images of these charts into the chat. Yeah, sure. I will get you guys a copy of the slides. But let's bring some people up on stage and see if we can construct a healthy debate. I'm going to bring some important people up here. Welcome, welcome.
Yo.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I'm privileged to be considered important.
I don't think I'm that important, but I did raise my hand for a question.
What's your question, Matt?
So my first question, just to make sure I'm understanding this all, my understanding is that all existing stake that's being delegated to validators is going to be automatically transferred to root, right? So will this have like a short-term immediate drop-off for subnet emissions and incentives for, miners and subnet participants if all this stake is now, being automatically transferred to root network?
So first of all, Matt, across all of the subnets, the amount of tau injection will always be 1. So there isn't a drop-off. Prices will be difficult to, it's difficult for me to know what the price will be because it really will depend upon the steady state market here. But to answer your question, no, emission will not go to 0.
Right. So I guess I never was worried about the emission going to 0 because I understand that stays constant, but wouldn't the emissions to root increase out of the gate and then the emissions to individual subnets decrease, or would that kind of align with the tau weight that you were just discussing that kind of like smooths out that curve?
Well, currently I think root emission is something about 8% on the current network, on current main. There won't be any burn that goes to root. So subnet emissions, quote unquote, tau in across the subnets, tau in emission across the subnets will actually go up immediately.
Interesting. Okay. I think I'm understanding. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. If people want to answer questions in the chat or just read them to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the APR as it's going up and seems to be a popular thing. I think there has to be a little bit of a narrative change from APR because obviously APR is an annual figure, and normally people look at APR as what they can expect. And I think everything we're learning about these charts and what will happen is that you won't be able to predict your future APR based on what's happened. I think the only APR people should start to look at is what they've actually made given their choices. And there'll be so many individual choices as to where you place your stake, how you interact with subnets or not, which subnets you back, which validator you're with and aligned with. The APR as an overall generalized touted around figure. I think what Const is showing there is just a shift in balance rather than a predicted APR that you might be getting. Because I think people have got very excited by triple figure numbers there, and I can see it ending up all over Twitter tomorrow.
Indeed. I perhaps misspoke and need to be more careful with what is meant there. And also, this is a very specific calculation. It is when calculating APR, it is if you own the first alpha, how many alpha would you have at the end of the year? Just if you held that on a subnet, it doesn't say anything about the price expectation or the exchange rate expectation of that subnet to tau. Right? The base APR obviously for tau itself is 17%. So there's like a risk-free rate here that doesn't change and is still pretty high. It's also worth noting that if the subnet exchange rates explode, so if they end up going above 1, the consequence actually is that Root's APR increases because they're cutting out of that price, if that makes sense.
And Mog, it's not for all alpha, it's just for the first alpha token. That's the key difference here.
Yeah, but I know what the chart meant. I just saw. I know you were in jest with 600%, but I know how very easily people cling onto these figures, and I kind of feel something we're trying to do, even to this point of saying validator APR, which I know a lot of people put a lot of value in now. And obviously, you can look at a validator APR on any of our sites, invest in that validator, and the validator can turn off all their hardware tomorrow or perform badly or whatever, and it's no longer an APR. So I would like people to push the shift towards APR is an annualized figure you can say on what based on what you made in the last year, or you can take your previous week or month or days earnings and multiply that by 365 or whatever. But it's not a promise, and that's what people tend to get led into, these promises of APR that are not attainable.
Yes, this is not a promise. This is a mathematical model which is talking about averages, right? So super important that people understand that. Perhaps something that shouldn't be presented in the slides, but I mean, I also respect the intelligence of the community, and I know that they can do the mathematics themselves.
What do you guys think about linear expansion on the subnets? Maybe we can try to get it more geometric, like to achieve more subnets per year.
Absolutely, Igor. We can change this over time. I feel like the value we're selecting here is a conservative one, so that we can slowly move up. Still, hundreds of subnets within a couple of years.
Right.
I mean, based on your mechanism, we can have 365 in the next year if people are willing to pay a continually increasing value to grab a subnet.
Exactly. That, of course, would be impossible because there's not enough tau in existence.
So Jake, in one of your PowerPoint slides, the tau weight exchange rate, it shows the sum of subnet exchange rates would probably be around 0.5 at the beginning of dTAO. And I think also in another PowerPoint slide, it was said that in the pool initially, there will be 10 tau and 10 alphas, meaning that the initial price of a subnet will be 1. So wouldn't it be better if the price of the subnet is initialized according to around the scale of the sum of exchange rate, which is around 0.5, so that we can avoid having the price initialized at 1 and then drop to 0.5, something like that?
Yes, there is added complexity there, because that exchange rate that you see on that chart is really with respect to no other effects in the network, right? So it also would change as the number of subnets increases. And so it's not easy for us to calculate that and also to set that without the amount of alpha that we select into the pool potentially be gamed by further and further registrations. So just for simplicity and consistency on behalf of subnet creators, we just using a standard amount.
Okay.
Sorry, I think it was answered. Sorry, in the comments earlier, but I missed it. If I register a subnet for more than 10 tau, let's say the price is 50 tau, is that putting more into the initial liquidity, or is that 10 goes in and the rest is just burned, recycled, burned?
Okay. Yeah. And the reason for this answer to that question is the same answer to Isabella. It's simply about making things incredibly consistent across the ecosystem, so that there's no weirdness.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Can I just clarify one last time for all subnet owners about all of their tau getting reimbursed from the law costs except for, is it 10 tau now?
Exactly. With the exception of 10 tau.
Hey, Const. So question about how you guys got to 18% for tau weight. But I think about tau weight is that the higher the value, the longer in terms of numbers of days that cell pressure is high for. And so one of the points on a slide you had was like larger tau weight slows the transition process from current validator to subnet alpha. I don't really understand this point. I mean, it feels like a fair or like a safe bet to make that current validators will also be subnet validators. And I'm not sure what type of like malicious potential there is from like a validator or somebody acquiring a lot of stake early on up in an alpha and then acting maliciously when it comes to validating, because again, I think the subnet validators will likely be existing validators. So I don't know. Could you convince me why tau weight shouldn't just be like half of what 18% is? So like set to maybe like 9%, just to make this whole painful period of root network auto dumping shorter.
It's a very good question. Why not a quarter of 18%? Why not a tenth or 100th? Like why root weight at all? So the overlapping period, I'll just put the chart here into the chat again so people can see it. And if you could bring it up in the chat, you can see that there's an inflection point at tau weight of 18%. Which is about month 5 or 4 months in, so to speak, roughly, more or less 4 months in. We're giving ourselves 4 months transition period before the alpha validator overtakes the current root validators. I think that's a sufficient amount of time for it to be smooth. Now, regarding like dumping on, I honestly think that it's very difficult for us to say whether or not the prices will be continuously dumped on and go to zero like we see on testnet as a consequence of people understanding the dynamics of the increased APR of the subnet tokens and understanding that if you're making a long-term play on the subnet, the price is the price, right? So your upside is basically based on, there's always be 21 million. One alpha is one alpha. These were really hard things to select, and ultimately we just picked the one that that looked best to us in the graphs. But there's actually, when it comes down to the selection of a hyperparameter, often it's very difficult to know what it should be. And ultimately it'll be people choosing to restake their tau from root that actually makes the difference. So that it will be people's active participation in staking and unstaking that determines what that tau weight really effective is. Because if you restake your root dividends, root weight actually is irrelevant. It doesn't matter for the price.
And hey, Const, I share some of that concern, that Sammy's bringing up there. I wonder if you guys looked at sort of the security, kind of the security that like tau and the pools would have at those different markers, because 30 days in you'd have 216,000 tau that's already been distributed to the pools, so 75 million or so across all the subnets. So is there a way to look at it from kind of an economic security, what it would take for someone to have an alpha position, that could take over a meaningful subnet?
Yes, I have done those calculations, and I didn't throw up more slides. There's an infinite number of slides that we could produce, but yes, you can quite easily calculate that, because you just look at the market caps, expected market caps of the subnet tokens over time, and then a 51% attack is just simply 51% of that. Let me see if I can bring that up, actually. While I'm looking for that, though, please continue to ask questions.
Root stakers still... go ahead.
I was just going to kind of like wrap up on that question I asked. Sorry, Keith. But yeah, 4 months seems like a very long time for this transition from like root validation to subnet specific validators. Again, I think the subnet specific validators are either going to be existing validators or the subnet owners themselves. And so this like long period doesn't seem necessary to me. At the same time, like if this was a one-time thing that was only happening like at this transition from like root era to now dynamic TAO, like that would make sense. But to have this for every new subnet, like even a year in the future, if like a new subnet was to register, them like having to wait 4 months for like this whole process, I don't know, seems a bit long, but I'll kind of dig deeper on my own to some of these values. But yeah, just wanted to end with that.
Great, Sambi, I would appreciate your finger on the scale around this discussion for what you think the proper term should be. If you have better argumentation, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and Cons in the chat, Marcia is kind of saying something similar, but I thought it was closer to 2 months, not 4 months, based on the 0.18 when we had looked at it previously.
Yeah, I'd have to get the exact number for you, Dave, but you can see it in the graph that the numbers are not lying there. It's simply the inflection point on the purple line.
Okay.
There's another element of TAO weight, which maybe I've misunderstood, but I really hope I haven't, which is as a validator, for instance, if I have, for example, 100K staked to me on root and I'm present on subnet 1, but then I also have 10K staked to me as alpha on subnet 1, my weight as a validator on that subnet includes the calculation for TAO weight. So my TAO is actually worth less in terms of my Yuma Consensus weight per se. So my subnet weight would be not 100K for the root TAO, but let's say 18 for this example, plus the 10 that I had as alpha. So it would be 28. So having more alpha stake actually gives you more consensus versus root on a subnet. Am I correct in thinking this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the combination of the two.
Yeah.
Couple of quick ones that I'm hoping didn't get answered when I briefly lost internet. With the discussion on subnet owners being able to disable transfers, is it worth looking at having transfers just disabled by default, and then subnet owners just enable them if they want? This way, subnets that need them disabled from start remain compliant in doing so. Also, second thing is just when you say burnt for the excess amounts of the TAO and the registration, is that burnt, gone for good, or just recycled like normal?
Burnt, gone for good. But
okay, so a reduction of the total 21 million.
No, actually, sorry, you're right. Properly recycled, because it actually just reduced the total issuance.
Okay, cool. And then the transfers?
The transfer fees?
No, sorry. When the ability to transfer detail from wallet to wallet, you were saying that subnet owners can opt to disable this. Would it not make compliance and life in general easier if transfers are disabled by default and then subnet owners can opt to enable it?
Well, I think that if people are worried about compliance, they could immediately turn it off. And just to be clear here, right? What they're turning off is the ability to do an atomic swap, right? In a single transaction. So, like, it is a minor change, and no, we'd like to keep it as a default on. And if people are choosing to turn it off, they have that option, right? So if they need additional time, they can choose that option.
Fair enough. Will there be an option to say when registering a subnet to set as part of the string of when you're registering it to say make new subnet but disabled transfers straight away?
Well, you're welcome to. You're welcome to make the extrinsic call the block afterwards capricious.
Okay.
I think that the difference here is negligible.
Yoon made a PR to start it off with
disabled?
The current PR that's going into main was linked to this channel here, Ref. You can take a look at it. All the code is there.
Yep, there is a PR which is like 10 minutes old, and it changes the default to false. But yeah, it doesn't matter much. The question I wanted to ask is about the smart contract and the proxy accounts, pure proxy accounts. Whether the flag is going to restrict those as well.
Restrict proxies? No. The flag is not restricting proxies.
The pure proxies owned by smart contracts, I mean. This is to protect the tokens temporarily from being wrapped.
Our perspective is that that's not the purview of the creator of the subnet. If people doing that themselves would take that risk, if you perceive it as a risk, Ref, that's on them.
I agree.
Yeah. So no, we're not going to restrict what can be done on the chain by others. And I think the purview of the creator is what within inside of the subnet itself. EVM is its own beast, which doesn't need to be restricted on the basis of a subnet creator. That's my perspective here. Now, again, it's important to note that we will be taking suggestions, and if there is sufficient argumentation to go one way or another, we will change. You are our masters.
Yep, I filed a suggestion to change that one temporarily, of course.
Keith, I see you lingering on the stage. Questions? Comments?
Yeah. Do the root stakers still have the opt-in for alpha tokens as opposed to receiving tau?
We chose to go with no on that because for a few reasons. One is it's 5 times as expensive for the Bittensor blockchain to do that for a variety of reasons. As far as we could do in terms of implementation, it was just extremely expensive. It required 3 additional triple maps on Bittensor. There's a lot of additional complexity in the design that would be subject to error on behalf of the developers. No matter how good we are, we were happy. We didn't think there's any errors, but complex, very complex. Additionally, it did require either people to have an additional operation that they'd have to perform to claim their operations, their rewards, their dividends, or the chain would have to do it automatically on a rolling cycle, which would affect the way in which the root dividends would have consequence on the price. So there would be a lot of randomness in the design that we didn't necessarily want to add, and also would be costly for the chain itself to perform. Now, finally, if someone chooses to build simply take my tau weight and redistribute it in alpha automatically, they would just have that option they could just build that themselves, and there are people that are building that for them already. So we felt like let's limit complexity in the core Coinbase design and allow for the complexity to be built by secondary teams around that spine. Now, in the future, if there is sufficient demand for this and we think that it will actually reduce chain costs to implement it, and potentially if we can do it in a more elegant manner, we can do this after the fact. So we can actually upgrade the chain and introduce that at a later date. Does that answer your question, Keith? That was our perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. I got a second question around the subnet cost. The drop on the cost on the graph that you have up on page, there's no page numbers, but it's like maybe the 5th slide, 6th slide. You got a drop on there from like 1,000 down to 300 initially. on launch. I'm trying to figure out what that slide means. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one that's lost on this, on the changes to subnet registration.
Okay, let's go look at it again here, Keith. So which slide are you referring to? This one or this one?
24.
Here, this one. Right. Okay, so let's explain this. Right now on mainnet, the cost to register a subnet expressed as a lock is based on demand and supply. So, and the way that works is that when a registration occurs for a subnet, we double the lock cost, and then it decreases over a half-life. So for instance, if the current lock cost is 1,000, it goes to 2,000, and then drops back to 1,000 over 7,200 blocks. Now, that half-life is what really determines the rate, because if people register before 7,200, it'll double at a value that is more than the original 1,000. So it went 1,000 to 2,000, then went down to say 1,500, and then up to 3,000, right? So when we pick that half-life, we are setting what we expect to be the market equilibrium rate of subnets, but we're registrations, but we're not picking the actual cost. So what you see on this graph is at the halving point, sometime next year, we have that half-life. So instead of being 38,000 blocks, the halving time from that the price goes from 1,000 to 2,000, then down to 1,000 again, being 5 days, we have it. So now it's 2.5 days. As a consequence, the prices can drop with the same amount of demand. So as you can see at this halving, this is why the cost to register a subnet halves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but none of this actually affects the price of the subnet that people have been paying, for the last, I don't know, let's say few months, at whatever it is, between 1,000 to 1,500 TAO or wherever the lock costs are. I mean, I get it. It just has no impact on what we've been doing up to this point, other than the halving occurring at some point in early 26. Do I understand that right?
Well, no. So you're saying that the changes here have no effect? Is that what you're saying?
On the cost of the subnet registration?
No, they will. So there are a couple things that will change the cost. Number one, it's no longer a lock; it's a burn. So the lock cost currently on mainnet is determined in many ways by people's expectation of the fact that they'll get the lock cost back when dTAO launches, right? So people are willing to lock a lot more. When it moves to a burn, people know that TAO is no longer accessible to them at any point in the future, and therefore won't be willing to pay as much. Another thing that will affect that price is the fact that there's 64 slots limit on Bittensor, which means that if you get deregistered, you go to register again with your same lock. There's a limited number of slots. Whereas when we uncap the limit, the total amount of subnet slots, what more people that are in demand of a subnet will be able to get their slot. And so they won't be sitting at the door, so to speak, trying to lock again to enter the system once more. So both of those things will significantly drop the cost to register a subnet. If you think about it, it's like the average, the cost is likely to be the average demand for those 128 slots, or actually additional 64 slots inside the year. So if you had N teams and they'd all be willing to pay X amount, you take the median value, or so it's like, well, the top 64 values and sum them. That would be the expected lock cost.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
How many subnets registered last year?
Good question. I do
bet
not
Doug
know.
has that info.
Who's Doug?
From tau stats.
Yeah, well, you can bring it up on tau stats, and I think we can get it from here.
Doug is scrambling for the API now and a PyBook. We'll have that answer shortly.
If I go to Subnets, does it show the cost right here? Count how many peaks there are in this.
Yeah.
That's the answer to your question. If somebody would like to do that. But it's probably about 128, double the number of subnets there are currently. That's my guess. If I was to put a number on it, maybe it even looks like slightly less. You have to count manually, no cheating allowed.
There's been a couple of people asking, I should say a few of the questions were talking about what overhead for the chain and performance and that sort of thing. Raises the next question of what's the TPS going to be looking like under this? How many swaps can we handle per block? How's it going to be handling the enter of degens?
That's a great question for someone like Voon from the Nucleus team. Actually, I don't know the answer to that question. It's 2 in a row. Our block sizes are 5 meg. Voon? I don't know if we can reverse from that. Do you know the answer to that question, Cameron?
I'm looking at the block API. That's the last ones.
Of course, that will depend on the size of the transactions. Set weights operations are quite large because they require that you set like hundreds of weights each U16, staking on sec up.
The last 50 was about 9,000 bytes average. Yeah.
And we can fit more into the blocks. We can fit more into the blocks now that we're doing lazy accounting on the disbursement to nominators, which is a crazy innovation on the chain for what we can do in terms of scaling.
I didn't realize, but we have it on tau market cap, all the registrations. 352. And what price they're registered at.
352 over what period of time?
Total.
Yeah,
a year and a half.
Is it 2 years or a year and a half?
Well, we can look at the beginning of this chart. October 2023.
So we're going to slow down significantly.
No, and the reason for that is that while the reason for that is that people will be not needing to register again because there's no deregistrations. A number of people have deregistered and then re-registered their subnet. So that's taken out of the design.
Well, we will slow down if you slow down the halving for the call.
Yes, the rate of subnet creation is slowed down, but the absolute number of subnets will increase. I think one of the reasons why we want to do this is also to slowly smooth ourselves into this design, and not overload ourselves with the complexity of going from 64 to say 1,000 subnets within a very short period of time.
Yeah, I can't order that many GPUs in a hurry.
Mike says, "Don't you think that's a bit slow?" Mike, we can take your suggestions. You do have a validator slot.
One question that has come up in a lot of discussions with both existing subnets and those wanting to register was the ability to burn their subnet tokens. Apparently, this discussion is still ongoing in Church of Rao. Is there any closer to a decision there?
Right. Well, if you toggle transfers, you can stake to a null address. But it does sound like
And that doesn't recycle.
Oh, it doesn't recycle. That's right.
No.
It fully burns. Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. I've actually never heard this before. What was the argumentation for this? Why do people want to recycle?
Coming online, baby.
Capturing subnet revenue, turning it into a buyback, and recycle.
Yeah.
And that's better than burning it outright?
Yeah. Because you pretty much like push back the halving events for the individual subnet emissions for the alpha tokens.
Okay, understood. That's an interesting idea. This is something that we could easily implement after the fact. It's not something that would drastically change the launch. So it's not something that I would suggest that we would vote no on. But it's a good idea.
Any plans to allow subnet owners to have some degree of flexibility, perhaps like within a range bound of how many UIDs can be on their subnet? So, for example, SN1 has 1024, everyone else has 256. Some might need 512 or whatever. Is that going to remain locked as is, or maybe a degree of flexibility?
I think that's secondary to the dynamic TAO upgrade. But yes, we have talked about allowing increased UIDs a number of times. It simply has been put on the back burner in terms of a development. But yes, like I think again, one of those things that we can easily add to the design post dynamic TAO doesn't affect anything we're talking about today. Caro, you're on stage.
Is the vote live? You have those 6
No, the vote is not live. We're going to do that carefully after this call between today and end of tomorrow.
And it'll basically just be on approving the current DevNet testnet code?
Exactly.
Cool.
Rob.
Yes, sir. I don't know. I'm just thinking about registration right now. This is all very exciting. Very exciting. I do think things like the recycling, like what Capricious was talking about, is going to be important. At least for some subnets, it should be like a toggle, I think. But I was thinking about registration, and I don't know if I understand exactly how registration works. So
subnet registration or miner registration?
Yeah, subnet. No, registering into a subnet.
Miner registration.
Yes.
So the cost to register is still measured in TAO, but when the registration occurs, we take the burn cost or the recycle cost, and we swap it into the pool for alpha and then burn the alpha. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, okay, so I've been thinking about so there's TAO or there's alpha in and alpha out, right? The alpha in is what goes into the pool, and the alpha out is what gets paid, distributed to the miners, correct?
Yes, and validators.
And validators. So if you, like Ref was recently saying in the chat that UID pressure means your subnet's terrible. And but wouldn't that actually be something that's maybe good in dTAO? Because if you have high registrations or there's a lot of churn in your subnet, right? That means that you're actually reducing the amount of. Did you see what I'm saying? Do you follow my logic here?
Yes. It becomes effectively buy pressure for the token.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems
you get 4 registrations per tempo, right? So regardless of whether you have 256 or 1000 UIDs, there's still maximum 4 registration per tempo. And if you have 1,000 of them, then if you use does the chain load thing, it's not good for the chain. As for subnet 1, this 1,000 is held by validators and about 3 miners. So it was believed long time ago that more UIDs will be better, but no, this is just UID pressure, and that's not a very good situation.
But in dTAO, UID pressure, I can agree with you that in the current paradigm, UID pressure is hard for miners. But I think it would still be hard for miners. I don't think that changes, right? But like, there's actually subnet owners, there's some sort of incentive there to have churn on your subnet because it recycles your alpha.
Yes. So it's interesting. We could have not done that, right? We could have, for instance, made it so the burn cost is in tau, it doesn't swap to alpha, and therefore it doesn't affect the subnet pool price or anything really, for that matter, except the issuance of tau itself. We chose to go with the latter because it allows subnet owners to gauge that design in their favor if it's something they want to optimize, because it does produce an optimization of your market in a subnet if you can choose, if you can make it so that if the competition is too easy for people on your subnet, that cost is pulled into the burn of the subnet token, right? So it can be beneficial, I think, for the economic design of a subnet. I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, me too.
Fish, for instance, I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Actually, you know a lot about this. Or others, if anybody else wants to come up on stage.
Does anyone have any thoughts?
This is why I definitely was suggesting for the ability for people to be able to voluntarily just recycle their alpha, because it's the same thing. Like, it just adds to the deflationary nature of like the economics of the subnet.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Like, it's you could see it, like the recycling, it just continues to incentivize future contributors proportional to like their contributions.
Recycling of alpha makes or burning makes sense in some subnets which cannot operate at some times. So there is a subnet that predicts S&P 500 price, and it just does not work on the weekend. And then no, the compute subnets could benefit from some horizontal scaling. So what compute subnets do is they allow miners to host many GPUs or many servers on one UID, or on in my case, in 3 UIDs, right? So we had like up to 22,000 executors, and about 60 UIDs were active. So that is not a problem. There is a subnet, I forgot which one it was, that had all of the minor UIDs were from the same cold key. This like UID pressure is not a good design, because then a small validator, as it was proven by Fish accidentally at some time ago, a small validator having like 5% of stake can give a 0 weight to a top miner, and that miner gets deregistered. This is not a good design. This is not how Yuma should work. Yuma generally tolerates bad actors that have less than 50% stake. And here, if someone has 5% stake and can ruin somebody's life, that is not something that should happen. So subnets should generally have a not flat incentive curve. One of the reasons. There's other reasons as well.
But don't you think that there's an incentive in dTAO to have something like churn?
I mean,
on your
you can manipulate the price, right? If you set the registration price high and then convince some people to go and burn some DAO, so add it to the left side of the liquidity pool and don't get anything on the right side of the liquidity pool, then great, then your perceived price increases, and then we can add burning of the alpha tokens. So whatever people earn, we can burn that as well, and then increase the price even further, right?
Caro,
We can do that.
when you're saying burning is a good thing by registrations, it's essentially the same thing if you're forcing people to burn as you just burning a percentage of the miner emissions, like allocating to a burn UID.
So
I was talking about this recently.
I'm not saying that this is a good thing, right? I was just thinking during the progression of the call that on subnets with UID pressure, right? That is there, and not all subnets with UID pressure have flat curves, right? There could be a lot of reasons why there's like UID pressure there, right? It could be because there's a lot of competition as well, and so how is that going? Like what I was thinking about is how is that going to affect the pools themselves, right? And it seems that like if there is a subnet, right, that wants to have their price be higher, I can't honestly think of why you would want to have a high price subnet, but like let's just suppose for a moment that you did, then having like
Wait.
I don't know if
your emissions is based on your price. What do you mean you don't know why you'd want your subnet price to be high?
I thought your emission was based off of the tau that's in the pool.
No, it's based off your price.
I see. Okay. So then there is, so then you would get more emission because you have a higher price. Okay. That makes sense. I don't know. We'll have to see how this plays out. I mean, I think that this sort of thing will happen organically, like just because there are subnets with UID pressure. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it's kind of like ETH as well, where it's like it has some inflationary pressure, like as the staking APY or whatever. And then there's like fee burning. So it's like the deflationary pressure. So it keeps things very stable.
Yep. It's based on demand of the smart contracts. But in this case, it would just be demand for like registering keys and then like, let's say revenue being recycled.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Rob, if you look at the screen, you can see the suggested tau emission design. Asterisks here, right? There are some amazing designers in the ecosystem like Igor, for instance, that are working with me to design better and better versions of this, what you're seeing on the screen. So this is subject to change, and it's okay because we don't affect the prices with the injection. So we leave that to our liberty. But as you can see, right, we're using the EMA, we're using your relative EMA price as tauin.
Very cool.
Yeah, and the EMA is the one here. So it does make it so it's very difficult for a team to affect their price with low liquidity. They actually have to maintain it to get even 50% of the price that they have for 30 days, right? So especially with root dividends, sell pressure, it's very difficult to just maintain an arbitrarily high price that's not actually based on the market equilibrium of your subnet.
Well, I'm going to go reread the paper. So thank you all.
Okay. I do got a question about the validator votes. So a few months in, when the block in which Yuma is calculated will be coming up, someone could theoretically take some tau and stake it into the subnet to strengthen its validator's position in terms of how much alpha it has, and then after the block, when Yuma calculates his thing, taking into account the higher weight, he can take it off and put it in another subnet, and then keep moving it between the subnets to increase their effective stake, right?
Yes, absolutely. And but at core, it's very difficult to move that amount of tau as a consequence of the market being liquid, right? So people can just dump on your amount of tau if you would do that, right? So it's not easy to manipulate the prices without putting a fairly large amount of tau at risk.
Right. So if I can see someone doing that, as soon as they buy, I can sell, and when they sell, I rock them. Right? Okay.
Yes, if people are trying to do that, yes, that's exactly what people would likely do. To Todd's question, the paper, yes, is actually being updated on the website right now with the current design. Small change.
Hello guys, hope you are good. I might have a great question, I'm not sure. But as we already discussed, we know that all the research subnets, they're gonna have a lot of suffers, let's say. So I wanted to ask you, is OTF planning to buy some alpha tokens of those subnets or not?
So OTF doesn't have much tau. Common misconception. All of the tau that is staked to the OTF's validator is from participants in the ecosystem, right? It holds very little itself. So OTF will not be participating itself. I think the question is more like, what are other people going to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually,
Yeah.
I think there will be like way less people investing in research subnet because they're not gonna have a business model, you know, and they are just dump, so it's gonna be tough for them.
It's a good question. Ultimately, a subnet on Bittensor needs to outline a path towards making the alpha inside of that subnet worth something. If it doesn't have that path, even if it's a long-term path, if it doesn't have any long-term path, then yes, it probably will not exist on Bittensor. But subnets like, for instance, 9 on Bittensor is a good example. Clearly, there is value to the ability to train machine learning models effectively and efficiently. Whether or not that's being expressed in terms of revenue today is not the same thing. So it may not actually matter that much for a subnet that has a path towards something of incredible value. Like a good example would be OpenAI, right? OpenAI loses $5 billion per year. Is it 5 billion or like 500 million? I'm not totally sure actually what the revenue is, but it's substantial. 5 billion, yeah. And yet, a lot of people understand the long-term value of what is being created there and the fact that it can be captured. So even if there is no like quote unquote like immediate revenue for a subnet, I don't think that means that the subnet would go to zero. Bittensor itself has always had this problem or this question, and we've had to frame the ecosystem output as utility, even if that utility doesn't match revenue, quote unquote, in terms of emissions. Another thing that's worthwhile saying is that and Subnet 9 is a perfect example. Again, sorry for biasing your subnet here, Will, but mining emission on Subnet 9 is probably many magnitudes larger than the actual cost to mine on that subnet. I think TensorPlex spent 50 grand to take the subnet for like multiple months and take the top slot. That's probably changed. That's many magnitudes less than what the dollar cost mining incentive was on that subnet. And if the miners on the subnet that are attaining that emission see the long-term value and potential of what is being built, they'll hold, and that does not become downward pressure on the price automatically, right? So it's super important for a subnet to make that argument about, hey, this is how the utility can be crafted and turned into revenue, but not necessarily at the moment, instantaneous at the moment.
I think with a lot of the research things, you have to look at how actually unique and valuable is this thing. So there's a lot of nascent Bittensor commodities that are great and high value, but they're not very unique and they're not very rare. Like, you know, I'm not going to say specific subnets, but like their market competition is much higher. There's no other dAI protocol that's actually successfully trained models, and there's a multitude of subnets on Bittensor that have. And you look at Noose launching their psych token recently, and the buy pressure into something that is just about a distributed training run. And I think, you know, you have to look at what's the underlying technology and its long-term value. You know, there's a lot of great things in, you know, is it the graphite subnet and how they're going to monetize traveling salesman problems or whatever? I don't know the specifics of it, but it's really attractive to be like, oh, the obvious thing is let's sell computers because we can sell that. But I actually think in some ways those subnets have a much harder job because they've got to go sell a shitload of computers because they know it's viable now. It's a very different type of valuation and type of investor.
Very good point, Will.
Yeah, also token utility is important. And you have to convince like potential token holders that holding onto your token or even like staking or running a validator has some utility, right? For example, like compute subnets offer an access to compute, right? And the same thing for other subnets, they can even research specific, right? The model still applies.
One thing that I think that subnet owners should think about right now, and I've said this to a number of them on calls, is what is the base cost to run the subnet? Is it like the number of synthetics that are piped through in order to do validation? And if that amount is too high, up until now, the cost has just been borne on Bittensor itself, but the cost in terms of running those synthetics will now be on the subnet. So it'll be very important for subnet owners to craft the validation system so that it's not overly expensive on behalf of their network, just the right amount to create the right amount of value or do the right amount of work so that they can showcase what they're doing and the system stays together and works as a functioning economy, but no more, right? Because, for instance, just running endless inferences over machines for no reason will be, you know, just needlessly computationally expensive and costly for the miners. I mean, Caro, you probably have a lot to say on this point because you've been working at length to make this balance work. I'd like to hear your perspective there, Rob, on how you're going to manage that. And same with Fish as well, and Ref actually.
Yeah, so we've been working really hard to make the Targon API where anyone can go permissionlessly deploy a model onto the subnet and then inference from there. We recently got integrated with OpenRouter. We've done about 800 million tokens today in organic volume. And one of the things that's really the priority for us right now is making sure that the subnet is stable enough and able to provide, the uptime and the speed required to be able to move to the paid models on OpenRouter. So once we're able to do, paid models on OpenRouter, we're really starting to compete with some of the biggest companies in the world, like biggest AI companies like Together AI. We processed more organic tokens on R1 distilled these past couple of days than they have. And, that really just demonstrates the power of that Bittensor has. Like, you just change the environment and it's like a living organism. It just completely reorients itself to maximally provide this thing that you're trying to produce. And so once we're able to participate in the paid models and are performant enough to be routed traffic, I think that something that would be really cool is like writing like a smart contract or something like that Open Router can send USDC to, or some value to that, paid out, and we can put that back into the subnet, so it's automatic, right? And it's early days on this still, but really promising stuff, and I think that we're pretty close to it. I know some other subnets are pretty close to it, and so it's a really exciting time.
Fish, I'd like to hear your perspective as well on like subnet economics, or how you imagine it going into detail.
Yeah, all subnet owners should be thinking about this. I'm honestly really excited that the prerogative of most subnets from now on won't be just basically let miners spend as endless amount of money as possible just to produce the best result to the synthetic query that nobody uses. So we need to balance that out with revenue to the subnet, or value in some way. Otherwise, people will obviously just decrease the synthetics and find more ways of judging quality rather than quantity, especially ways that don't require like hundreds of GPUs or something. And so on Subnet 51, that's relevant because right now people are just running as many GPUs as possible as is profitable, basically. So I have a couple ideas in mind to change this. For example, we can only show like one of each GPU until it's rented, or like the user from the front end can say, I want a GPU with these specifications. And the miners can compete to be the first one to produce a good GPU with those specifications. But they're not basically sitting on the subnet all idle 24/7, and we're paying for that uptime now. Another thing would be we only put the miner emissions through the subnet that actually comes through us in revenue at a maximum. So that way we're always at least net zero, and we're never net negative in terms of revenue coming in and revenue going out to the miners. And we can just burn the rest of the miner emissions.
Many subnets have way more capacity than they have organic traffic, but their budget is fixed by their token price, right? And so they keep overpaying the miners, and they keep the miners compete with each other because they have the budget, and then it all goes to waste. This is not good for TAO community in general, but there was no way to incentivize people to stop it. Now there is, but there are some subnets which, in order to mine it, you have to spend significant amount of money on resources, and the margins of miners are small, so they spend over 90% of what they earn on server fees, so they have to continuously unstake and sell it over to the exchange and pay Bezos or whoever for hosting.
Yeah,
And
a lot of the current designs of subnets are really bad for Bittensor. Like, for example, Subnet 18 just producing synthetic queries that aren't being used with no integrations in apps. Subnet 51, which has all of the GPUs available, but not like a small percentage is actually rented. Subnet, well, I'm calling out my own, but I feel like I shouldn't call it other subnets too. But there's where the miners need to have like 70 H100s just to be able to serve a massive amount of synthetic queries, or just to be able to serve synthetic queries like a couple milliseconds faster. But maybe 1% of those queries are actually being used in terms of a revenue generating output or some sort of application. Other than that, it's just like synthetic scoring. So it's going to be the main focus of subnet developers to revamp their incentive mechanism to just look at quality without like endless computational costs to get that quality.
Okay, but have you actually tried doing it and reworked the subnet incentive mechanism to prevent this from happening without the support of burning or like recycling alpha? Because I did. That's not an easy task. I don't think it is possible, and I think all the compute and inference subnets are going to go hurt.
Yeah, I just spent 2 minutes answering that question about how I'm going to do that on Subnet 51.
Yeah. I've listened to those, and I went through those, and I went through some others. But subnets which don't have those costs are going to win. And I think maybe adding the burning for the release it might actually be a necessity in order to protect all the inference and compute subnets.
Yeah, of course. We should absolutely let owners burn some amount of their miner emissions if they're being overpaid in miner emissions. But Ref, you opposed that when I said that in Church of Vow, I think just today.
I mean, we did discuss it, and I eventually agreed with your point. I think this is something that we should do. And I think, like, the longer we talk about it, the more I realize we have to do it before the release.
Yeah.
Can I get a specific on what you're asking?
Let there be a burden UID that, for example, we can just cycle all front-end revenue in terms of miner emissions and not pay out any more miner emissions than that, and then just set weights to the burden UID for anything more than that, so that you never pay out more in miner emissions than you're getting in revenue.
I understand. So this is something that would have to be organized by the validators themselves, correct? And it would reduce...
No, it's something that just needs to be set on chain, where you can set weights to a specific UID, and then in the run Coinbase or in the drain hotkey emissions, if it's that specific UID or that specific hotkey, it just gets burned or recycled or whatever. The TAO that's on that hotkey or UID.
The alpha.
Right. So just for miners.
Correct.
Well, it'd be great if it existed for everybody. But miners would be the most important way to start. I think when you start talking about burning validator emissions, it gets dangerous, because the entire reason we made the design with the root selling is to protect against Ponzi's, where people incentivize you to buy and hold the token. The root selling is important to push those tokens down. So if you're able to just burn all validator emissions, then you don't have the root selling feature, which is a sort of protection layer against Ponzi's on Bittensor.
Yes. So validators on the Subnet would have the option to burn miner emissions, but not validator emissions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Is anybody against that? Actually, if someone is against that and is on this meeting, speak up now, because we want to hear the other side.
I guess a question regarding that would be, if we still have like a 1:1 ratio between the miner and validator emission pool, and the validation is supposed to be cheaper for the commodities that miner create, meaning that ultimately the miner payout should be somehow higher than validator, then it would make sense for the subnet owner to be able to reduce the validator payout. And so not being able to burn it because of, I guess, the ignition of Ponzi scheme, which I don't totally get, seems kind of counterintuitive to me.
Okay, so there is a very important thing. You cannot do it ever so that the miners earn more than validators. That's an important constraint of Yuma, and if you break that, it's going to be a problem. So validators need to earn equal amount or higher amount than miners. Okay, and somebody else asks to rephrase it because they get lost in the exchange between me and Fish. Short version is, we want to make it so that the validators can vote for a special UID that is not actually a miner, but it causes the incentive, so miner emissions, to be recycled rather than paid out. That's it.
So I like the idea.
I'm sorry. What would be the consensus to reach that that effectiveness? Like how many validators would have to vote?
This would work the exact same way the current emission distribution is decided. So using hyperparameters and Yuma.
Yes. So this would be something that I would bin in the can happen after dynamic TAO rather than before.
I
dealing with
think
a
after
lot.
the first day, it's going to be over, right? So because miners of cost-heavy subnets will have to dump in order to sustain their operations, and then the prices are going to shift towards other subnets, and all the compute subnets and inference subnets might die before we, on the second day, deploy it. So that's why I think it's important to deploy it on day one.
So
I'm not sure, because I think those subnet owners, they just need to back enough DAOs, like they need to prevent it. So for instance, if they are making money like Celium, they just have to keep enough DAOs to send to their miners directly, or to buy alpha tokens. That's it.
So actually, another way to answer this question also, Rapido, is that the effect is the same. If you, the cell pressure on your subnet is the same amount, whether or not you, in dollar terms, whether or not you constrain your token emission or not. It's the same amount of cell pressure. Do you see? So you have to then just contract what you're supplying, is what you're saying. But I don't think that I'm not so sure that the way that you're thinking about it actually makes any sense. So you contract the supply to keep your price high, but then actually your price has to be decreased because you have to still pay the same amount to your miners if the synthetics are so high. Do you see, Fish?
Oh, so we will lower the synthetics because we will lower the emission. They will not be able to provide 1,000 GPUs. They will only bring you 100 because they won't be able to sustain 1,000.
And then the solution is just to cap synthetics, right? So if you're trying
it's
to
obvious. Just basically everyone should just turn off synthetics completely and just wait. I mean, like one per day to get the quality of all of the UIDs, score them that way, set weights right there, and then you're like, okay, we have great quality, and then start trying to get integrations, and then with other apps, and then those are the only ones you should put through the subnet.
So without needing to change the token economic design that is consistent across all subnets on Bittensor, you, as the subnet creator and the person that can change the validator code on behalf of the subnet, can just cap the number of synthetics. So if you want less cell pressure on your subnet, Fish, because you cannot afford it, then you should just cap the number of machines that people can bring. You just be like, we're not going to pay for any more than this. Rather than burning the tau, or the alpha token with a kind of a complex mechanism that we have to build in last minute, which I'm not totally sure is possible, just cap the amount of synthetics on your subnet. Because it doesn't, you're by changing the economic design of your token, you're not actually affecting the underlying the cost basis for your miners.
Yeah, it's a cool idea. So we could do something very similar. Without actually burning, we still give more money to the miners, but they're not forced to sell it that way. So we're like, okay, we can only have 100 H100s, or like 5 more that are rented plus 5. And then people now have 5 H100s to choose from if they care about like location or CPU or something like that.
Exactly. So it's rather than making it something that is ingrained into the chain and changes the token economics of all the subnets, just make it something that can change off the spine of the design. That's what I would say.
It's somewhat similar, but obviously those miners can still sell. They're getting rewarded for something. They're getting over rewarded now for something that they don't really deserve.
But that would be the same for all the subnets that you brought up as an example for the subnets that would just beat the inference provider subnets in the first place, right? So the ones that don't have any cell pressure, I don't know how they're getting attraction anyways, but supposedly they are in the same boat as you, right? The miners are getting paid for not doing the work, right? It's going to be chaotic initially, no matter what, for sure. And that early chaos will then smooth over into stability over the next year. That's my suspicion of what will happen. But a subnet needs to figure out how they can argue the long-term value proposition of the commodity that they are running. I think ultimately, and yeah, be careful about the number of synthetics. I think that's super important. Like if it's just so expensive to run a miner and you have to sell everything, I think it does put you at a disadvantage to more well-crafted subnets themselves.
I mean, people will probably find a way to get around the burn. Like I've been thinking about ways to do this for the last week now. Without it integrated into Subtensor, it's almost impossible to find a native way. But like you can do things like send less than 500 RAW to a bunch of addresses, and that will all get burned because it's less than the existential deposit. Or you can create a period where you set the min burn really high, and then just register for 100 tau to essentially recycle that amount of tau or alpha.
Yeah, and you can force the miners to do that periodically, otherwise they are going to be penalized for not doing it. But that kind of seems like a very involved mechanism, and if it was just supported by the chain, it would be easier.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Scintillating.
So delightful. So we are going to go and make this vote on the chain. There's a 6-day grace period for it going through or not. We need 7 of 12. Keith is one of those. Fish, you're one. Rob, I believe you're one. I'm certainly one. Mog is certainly one of those votes. Yuma is one. Polychain is another. Capricious is another vote. We also have Tau 5 voting. We have Tau Validator voting. We have Crucible voting. Who am I missing? I think that's it. Maybe not. There's probably one or two that I'm missing here. Apologies. So, yes, maybe TensorFlex as well. And Rizzo, right. First tensor. Okay.
How do we vote? I was in the Senate before.
You can use the CLI. So it's BT CLI proposal underneath root.
Cool.
Root proposals you can use, and we'll put a document tomorrow for people that do want to vote, and we'll see how that goes. And we'll also be here in the Discord to receive feedback. Also following Twitter. True.
When will the vote go live?
Day and tomorrow.
Cool.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming to the call. It was fantastic. Really exciting. Thanks, Raf, for being on stage. Mog, Dr. P, Fish, Rapido, Igor, Gigesh, Message, Voon, Zoro, Nick, and Caro. Sorry, I totally butchered those names. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you. Congrats.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.